The village of Ashmore had not seen rain in 3 months, and hunger had a way of making people sign papers they never wanted to sign. Alira Voss stood in the doorway of her father's forge, watching him fold a letter with shaking hands, and she already knew what it meant before he said a word. "They are calling in the debt," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "The Lycan court says a life is worth more than coin. They want a person, not payment." Alira did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears did nothing to soften iron, and they would do nothing to soften this. Instead, she wiped the soot from her hands, the same hands that had spent 10 years hammering blades and horseshoes at her father's side after her mother died, and she said, "Then I will go." Her father protested, of course. He said it should be him, that a daughter should never pay for a father's debts. But they both knew the truth. The Lycan court did not want an old man with a weak back. They wanted someone who could survive the journey north, through the mountains where the air turned thin and the wolves ran free under a king who was rumored to have no mercy in him at all. They called him Kale Draven, the Ruthless King. Stories about him traveled faster than trade caravans. Some said he had torn a rival apart with his bare claws in front of his own council. Others said he laughed while his enemies begged. Alira did not know which stories were true, and which were exaggeration born of fear, but she knew enough to be afraid. Still, she packed a small bag, kissed her father's cheek, and left Ashmore before the sun rose, so she would not have to watch him weep. The road north was long and unkind. She traveled with 2 guards who barely spoke to her, men who treated the journey like herding cattle, rather than escorting a person. By the time the black towers of the Lycan stronghold rose against the gray sky, Alira's boots were worn through, and her spirit was worn thinner still. But she straightened her back as they led her through the gates, because she refused to enter that place looking like something already defeated. The inside of the fortress was nothing like she expected. It was not grand or golden. It was built for strength, not beauty, with stone walls thick enough to survive a siege, and torches that burned low and steady, casting long shadows down every hall. She was led not to a chamber, not to a kitchen, not even to a cell, but down a narrow staircase that smelled of sweat and old blood. "What is this place?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The pits," one guard said flatly. "Sold humans earn their place here. You fight, or you are worth nothing to the court." Alira's stomach turned, but she said nothing. She had not survived a life of hard labor and a harder father's grief, only to fall apart the moment she was afraid. She followed the guard into a wide stone chamber ringed with iron bars, where a crowd of Lycans watched from above, and in the center stood a boy no older than 17, already bruised and bleeding from a match before hers. She was given no time to prepare. A woman with a scarred face and cold eyes read a list of rules, most of which amounted to survive or do not. Then Alira was pushed into the ring. Her opponent was larger than her, faster than her, and clearly experienced. Alira's hands, calloused from years at the forge, closed into fists out of instinct rather than training. She had never fought anyone, not truly, but she had spent a decade learning how a hammer moves, how weight shifts, how to strike something without breaking her own wrist in the process. It was not the same as combat, but it was something. She lost that first match. She lost badly, in fact, ending up on the ground with blood in her mouth, and her vision swimming, but she did not stay down. She pushed herself up before the count ended, swaying but standing, and the crowd above went quiet for just a moment, as if surprised. From the shadows of a raised balcony, a pair of golden eyes watched her rise. Kale Draven had seen 1,000 fighters pass through his pits. Most were forgettable. Some were strong. Very few refused to stay down when their bodies were screaming at them to remain still. He had not planned to watch the newest arrival fight. He rarely did. But something about the way she walked into the ring, spine straight despite her fear, had caught his attention before she ever threw a single strike. He said nothing that night. He simply watched, and when the match ended, he turned and left before anyone noticed how long he had stayed. Alira did not know she had been watched. She only knew that her whole body ached, that her hands were raw and swollen, and that she was given a small, cold room with a single blanket and told to rest before the next match, whenever that would be. Days passed. She fought again and again. Sometimes she won, More often she lost, but she never stopped rising. She began to learn the rhythm of the pits, the way opponents favored one side, the way exhaustion made even the strongest fighters careless near the end. Her hands, already familiar with pain from years of forge work, grew more scarred, more calloused, more her own. It was during her 5th match, against a Lycan warrior twice her size, that everything changed. She fought well, she fought harder than she ever had. But in the final exchange, a heavy blow sent her crashing to the stone floor, and this time, her body did not want to rise. Her vision blurred, blood ran warm down the side of her face. She heard the crowd, distant and muffled, as if she were underwater. She thought, quite clearly, that she might die in that ring, far from her father's forge, far from anyone who would grieve her properly. Then the crowd went silent. Illyra did not understand why, until she felt someone kneel beside her. Through swollen eyes, she saw him for the first time up close. Cale Draven did not look like a monster from a fireside story. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he rarely let others see. His eyes were sharp, gold, and fixed entirely on her. No one in that chamber had ever seen the king leave his throne for a fallen fighter. Fallen fighters were dragged away and replaced. That was the way of the pits. That was the way of his court. But Cale reached down and took her hands, not gently pulled her up, not simply checked if she lived. He held her battle-worn hands in his, turning them over as if reading a story written into her scars and calluses. Then, in front of his stunned generals, his silent court, and a crowd that had gone utterly still, he pressed his mouth to her bruised knuckles. It was a gesture few in that room had ever witnessed. Among the Lycans, such an act was not casual. It was not comfort given freely to strangers. It was a mark of claiming, of reverence, reserved only for a mate. Illyra, barely conscious, did not fully understand what was happening. She only felt warmth where there had been only cold stone and pain, and she heard whispers erupt around her like a struck match catching flame. He healed? A voice were speaking somewhere else, but she was already asking herself something else. Was this real? And slowly slipping into darkness. She woke hours later in a bed far softer than anything she had touched since leaving Ashmore. Sunlight, real sunlight, spilled through a window she had not known the fortress possessed. Her wounds had been cleaned and wrapped by careful hands, and sitting in a chair beside her bed, watching her with an unreadable expression, was Cale Draven himself. "You should not have come to the pits," he said finally. "I did not have a choice," Illyra replied, her voice hoarse. "No," he agreed, "you did not." He looked for a moment, almost troubled by that fact. "But you refused to break." Illyra pushed herself up slightly, wincing at the pull of stitches along her side. "Is that why you—" She stopped, unsure how to finish the question, unsure if what she remembered from the ring had truly happened, or if it had been a dream born of blood loss and fear. "Yes," Cale said simply, understanding what she could not ask. "It is not something I do lightly." "Then why do it at all?" she asked. "You let me fight. You let me nearly die down there. If you cared whether I lived, why not simply spare me from the start?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Illyra saw something beneath the cold reputation, something almost like guilt, because mercy shown too soon, in this court, is read as weakness, and weakness here gets you killed, not just yourself, but everyone connected to you. I needed to know you could survive this world before I ever let myself consider more. Illyra studied him carefully. He did not look like a man who enjoyed cruelty. He looked like a man who had learned to wear it as armor, the same way she had learned to wear silence and steady hands, as her own kind of protection. "I am not a prize to be tested and then claimed," she said, her voice steadier now despite her exhaustion. "I am not something you sold for, and I will not be something you simply keep." Cale did not look angry at her words. If anything, something in his expression eased, as though he had expected, even hoped, for her to say exactly that. "I do not want to keep you," he said. "I want you to choose to stay, if you ever can." The days that followed were unlike anything Illyra had known in the fortress before. She was not returned to the pits, she was not treated as property, nor was she smothered with false gentleness meant to buy her silence. Instead, Kale visited her often, speaking plainly about his court, his people, the wars fought before her arrival, and the reasons behind rules that had once seemed cruel and senseless to her. She learned that the pits, brutal as they were, had once been the only way sold humans could earn protection, and standing within Lycan society, a twisted mercy born from a history of humans being discarded entirely. She learned that Kale's reputation for ruthlessness had been built deliberately, a shield against rivals who would exploit any softness in their king. And slowly, carefully, she began to see the difference between the monster the stories described and the man who sat beside her bed each evening, asking about her father's forge, her mother's memory, the life she had left behind. In turn, Elira spoke of Ashmore, of drought and debt, of years spent shaping iron, because it was the only inheritance her father could offer her. She spoke of losing her mother young, of learning early that survival required strength. No one should have to build so soon. Kale listened in a way few had ever listened to her, without pity, without interruption, simply present. Weeks passed before the court gathered again, this time not for a match in the pits, but for a formal announcement. Elira stood at Kale's side, her hands no longer hidden, no longer something to be ashamed of. The scars remained, evidence of every match she had survived, every strike she had taken and returned. But now those same hands were adorned with a simple band of dark metal, forged not by a court jeweler, but by Kale himself, in secret, using techniques Elira had once described to him from her father's workshop. When she addressed the court for the first time, her voice did not shake. "I did not come to this place by choice," she said, looking out over the gathered generals, warriors, and nobles who had once watched her bleed for entertainment. "I came because I was sold, because my family owed a debt I could not refuse to pay. I fought in your pits not for glory, but because I refused to disappear quietly." She paused, feeling Kale's steady presence beside her. "I stand here now, not because I was chosen for my usefulness, or because I was expendable enough to spare a father's grief. I stand here because I chose to stay, after being given the freedom to leave. That is not a small thing. It should never be treated as one." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the pits. It was not shock born of fear. It was something closer to respect. Kale took her hand then, the same battle-worn hand he had once kissed in front of a stunned court. And this time, he did not hide the meaning behind the gesture. He held it openly, proudly, in front of every soul who had once doubted a souled woman could ever stand as anything more than a fighter thrown away for sport. Elira Voss had arrived at the Lycan stronghold, expecting to be forgotten, expecting to be broken, expecting, perhaps, to die far from home and unmourned. Instead, she had found something she never anticipated, in a place built on old cruelty and older fear. She had found a king, willing to kneel before a fallen stranger. She had found hands as scarred as her own, willing to hold hers not out of pity, but out of respect earned through blood, patience, and truth. And in a court that valued strength above all else, she had found that her own quiet, unbreakable strength was enough, not because someone had given it to her, but because it had always been hers to claim.